Welcome to the deep dive. Imagine for a moment peeling back the layers of history, not to survey sweeping decades, but to zoom in on a single pivotal day.
Right.
That's exactly what we're doing today, focusing our lens on July 2, 1942.
A really specific moment.
Exactly, our mission. To explore what the world's newspapers were reporting about Russia on this specific day, offering you a unique, almost real-time snapshot of the Eastern Front and its broader global ripple effects.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to distill the critical information, uncover the surprising facts, and immerse you in the unfolding drama drawn directly from the sources you've shared with us. Think of it as your shortcut to being well-informed without drowning in an ocean of yesteryear's headlines.
Yeah, cutting through the noise.
You'll hear the raw reports of the time painting a vivid picture of a world locked in brutal conflict, seen through the eyes of contemporary journalism.
And that focused approach, zeroing in on a single day, is truly fascinating because it allows us to see how events, even those seemingly disparate and disconnected, were intricately interconnected across the globe.
Right? You see the threads.
Exactly. We can then begin to understand how these immediate realities were shaping public perception and understanding. Today, we're going to meticulously examine the military realities on the ground, the political maneuvering influencing the war, the profound human costs.
This must have been immense.
Oh, absolutely. And even the disquieting reports of grave injustices, all captured and reported in the press on July 10, 1942. It's about understanding the immediate unfolding reality of the war, grounded in the reporting from that specific moment in history. A. Military developments on the Eastern Front.
To truly grasp the world's understanding of July 2, 1942, we simply have to start where the conflict was at its most brutal, the Eastern Front. The sources you've provided paint an uncompromisingly stark picture of intense, often desperate engagements. Where should we begin to unpack this?
Well, the most prominent military news, you really can't miss it, revolved around the siege of Sevastopol.
Right, that had been going on for ages.
For months, yeah. A multi-month grinding assault. And on July 2nd, Berlin, well, German reports were confidently claiming Sevastopol had finally fallen.
So they were declaring victory.
Oh, absolutely. The reports emphasized the sheer scale of the fortifications they said they'd overcome, describing, strong forts, dugouts driven into rocks, subterranean bastions, concrete pillboxes, and countless field positions that had been taken in what they called an exemplary manner. The Chicago Tribune, for example, echoed this decisive tone, stating simply, "German flag flying over Red Bastion," Berlin says.
Okay.
So this marked a really significant psychological and strategic pronouncement from the German High Command.
So a very clear and decisive German declaration of victory. But how did the Russians, or the Soviets, as they were often referred to, respond to this narrative? Did they confirm such a complete and utter collapse of their defenses?
Not entirely, no. Russian communiques, you see reports in the AP Journal and the Times, for instance, offered a more nuanced acknowledgement. They admitted that the Germans had indeed succeeded in advancing.
Okay, an advance, but not necessarily the whole story.
Right. And they reported that fierce hand-to-hand fighting was still raging. Crucially, the Times noted a Russian withdrawal to Peninsula, which really suggests a strategic retreat under pressure, a managed disengagement,
Right.
rather than an outright unconditional surrender or the complete collapse of the defense as Berlin was painting it.
Mm-hmm.
So from the Soviet perspective, it painted a picture of a difficult but still managed situation.
Yeah.
And this distinction is vital for understanding the competing narratives of the day.
That distinction, between a claimed fall and a strategic withdrawal under fierce fighting, that's incredibly important for how the news was perceived back then. What about the immense human and material cost of such an extended and brutal siege? Were there any figures reported that hinted at the scale of the sacrifices?
The immense losses and costs were certainly a major theme in the reporting. The Daily Express, for example, underscored the almost mythical glory of Sevastopol for its role in holding up Hitler's advance. It's explicitly stating that tens of thousands of Germans have died before Sevastopol.
Tens of thousands, just there.
Just there. The Associated Press Journal corroborated this heavy toll, noting that the Germans had lost well over 20,000 at an enormous cost during their advances into the city.
Okay.
Furthermore, the sheer perceived significance of this engagement for the Axis was highlighted by the Herald Mail, which quoted German reports describing Sevastopol as the strongest land and naval fortress in the world.
So they were building it up as this massive achievement.
Exactly. And the Axis also underlined the victory by promoting General Manstein, the commander of Nazi forces there, to field marshal. And apparently all German soldiers involved received special medals.
Right.
This level of recognition really signals the profound strategic and psychological importance the Axis attached to
Hmm.
this very hard-won victory.
It sounds like Sevastopol was a Pyrrhic victory for Germany, maybe. Immensely costly, but still a significant strategic loss for Russia. What were the broader strategic implications of this for the Eastern Front, especially given the resources Germany poured into it?
The strategic implications were, in fact, quite significant. The Associated Press Journal alluded to a pincer's grip, a military term for a strategy
Hmm.
where two attacking forces converge from different directions to trap an enemy.
Right, encircling them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This suggested a tightening of Axis control in the region, potentially encircling remaining Soviet forces or critical infrastructure. Even more forebodingly, the Daily Express warned that hundreds of thousands of German troops and many hundreds of German planes were now set free for Hitler's other campaigns.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It is. And this wasn't just about redeploying forces within the Eastern Front. It signified a major shift in the available Axis forces, potentially allowing them to intensify pressure elsewhere on the Eastern Front or even open new strategic operations in other theaters of war, further intensifying pressure on the already beleaguered allies.
So, a major tactical victory for Germany that frees up significant resources, raising the stakes across the board. But beyond Sevastopol, it seems the Germans were not resting on their laurels, pressing elsewhere on the Eastern Front simultaneously. Where was their next major push focused?
Precisely. The focus was also heavily on the Kursk offensive.
Kursk, right.
The Daily Herald reported that the Germans yesterday tried to extend their offensive along the whole Kursk front 175 miles north of Kharkov. This wasn't just a localized skirmish. It indicated a substantial multi-sector attack designed to widen their territorial gains and strategic reach. The Daily Express confirmed that the attack launched by General von Bock east of Kursk was indeed being described as Hitler's Great Summer Offensive, suggesting this was just the initial phase of a much larger campaign.
The Great Summer Offensive. That sounds ominous.
It does. The paper also hinted that similar scale attacks could commence at any moment in other sectors, reflecting German intentions for a wider, coordinated summer campaign. The Daily Express also quoted Russian words describing the attack as having assumed a particularly fierce character, emphasizing the sheer intensity and brutality of the fighting, even from the Soviet perspective.
So this was clearly a major offensive, characterized as Hitler's Great Summer Offensive. What was the initial Soviet response to this new push around Kursk and elsewhere? Were they able to stem the tide immediately?
Well, the Daily Worker U.S. reported on an initial Soviet counterassault that had some success near Moscow. Apparently, German forces had launched an attack along the historic high road to the capital through the Gazatsk area, about 112 miles west of Moscow.
That close to Moscow.
Relatively speaking, yes. However, the Red Army mounted a swift counterassault that reportedly stemmed the initial thrust and killed 2,500 of the advanced shock troops.
2,500 killed. That's a significant counterpunch.
It is. It indicates a successful immediate defensive action, demonstrating that while German pressure was immense, the Soviets were capable of delivering significant blows in return, even in the early stages of a major offensive.
That's a good example of immediate Soviet tactical response. What about the Red Army's overall resilience in the face of these new large-scale offensives? Were they holding their ground or were they, on the verge of collapse, as some might have feared?
The Daily Worker U.S. specifically emphasized the remarkable resilience of Soviet infantry. It reported they were holding their positions without moving a step back in the face of the German attacks.
Moving a step back. Wow.
Yeah, the paper stated that the infantry proved stalwart and properly trained, which speaks volumes about their morale and defensive capabilities even under immense pressure. They were said to have skillfully utilized both natural and artificial barriers to their advantage, underlining their tactical discipline and adaptability.
So determined defense.
Very. And the Daily Express also noted that Russians are still returning blow for blow, indicating an active and aggressive defense rather than a purely passive resistance. There was one particularly grim but telling anecdote from the Daily Worker U.S. It describes a Soviet battery commander under German tank encirclement ordering direct fire at me.
Direct fire on his own position.
Yes, highlighting an extraordinary level of grim determination and self-sacrifice that seemed to characterize the Red Army's fighting spirit during these critical battles.
So we see a mixed but intense picture. Immense German pressure, particularly with the capture of Sevastopol and the widening offensive around Kursk, but also very notable Soviet resistance and immediate effective counterattacks. The sheer scale of the conflict and the immense human cost are evident in both the German claims of victory and the Russian admissions of fierce ongoing battles. This brings us, naturally, to the broader political landscape surrounding these battles, which undoubtedly felt the ripple effects of the Eastern Front's intensity and played out on a global stage. 2. Political developments with a direct impact on the war in Russia. The intense fighting on the Eastern Front naturally had significant political ramifications, echoing across both the Axis and the Allied powers. What were some of the key political pronouncements or debates happening on July 2nd, 1942, that directly bore on the war in Russia?
Well, one very notable pronouncement on July 2nd, 1942, came directly from Germany, offering insight into their strategic intentions. Dr. Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, in an article published in Das Reich, made statements that directly addressed Allied concerns about a second front.
Ah, the ever-present Second Front issue.
Exactly. And he articulated a chilling long-term Axis strategy. Both the Daily Express and Daily Herald quoted Goebbels, declaring that widespread defense measures along the coastline of Western Europe, ordered by Hitler, are ready to oppose any British attempt to open up a second front.
So basically warning the Allies off, don't even try it.
Precisely. This statement clearly aimed to deter any Allied land invasion in the West, thereby implicitly relieving military pressure on Germany's eastern flank and ensuring that their forces remained committed to the brutal war in Russia.
So Goebbels was actively trying to prevent the opening of a second front in Western Europe, which was, of course, a constant demand from the Soviets to ease pressure. But his comments went far beyond just deterrence, didn't they? He spoke of a much grander, almost terrifying global Axis ambition.
He certainly did. Goebbels further articulated this chilling long-term goal for the Axis, stating quite plainly, "In my view, Germany and Japan intend, if possible, to join each other through Russia or India in the Middle East this year."
This year, 1942, that's incredibly ambitious.
Hugely ambitious. As reported by the Daily Express, this reveals a truly grand and audacious Axis plan to establish a contiguous landmass under their control, stretching from Europe to Asia.
Wow.
This vision had immense and direct bearing on the Eastern Front, as it explicitly envisioned Russia as a pathway, or perhaps a massive barrier to be overcome for this global link-up.
Right. Russia was geographically central to that plan.
Exactly. It highlights the strategic stakes far beyond individual battles, emphasizing a total war vision with massive geopolitical implications that would redraw the map of the world. What's fascinating here is how, even amidst the brutal grind of tactical battles, the Axis leadership was operating with this sweeping, long-term geopolitical vision.
A stark contrast, perhaps.
Yes, a stark contrast to the more immediate defensive concerns occupying the Allies on that very same day.
While Germany was projecting these grand strategic visions and actively trying to deter a second front, what was happening in the Allied camp, particularly in Britain, it seems there was significant internal debate about their war conduct, especially in light of recent military setbacks.
Oh, absolutely. The sources reveal intense discussions playing out in the British Parliament, largely influenced by the immense pressure from the Eastern Front and the ongoing desperate need for Allied support, which was particularly felt by the Soviets.
So the events in Russia were directly impacting debates in London.
Directly. The Times, Los Angeles Times, and Daily Herald all reported on an all-night debate or a most violent day of vituperation in the House of Commons concerning what were called Libyan reverses.
Ah, the Desert War setbacks.
Yes. Although this internal scrutiny was focused on military setbacks in North Africa, its implications were profound for the overall Allied war effort and, crucially, for the potential opening of a second front in Europe, a non-negotiable demand from the Soviet Union to alleviate the immense and unsustainable pressure they faced on the Eastern Front.
It sounds like the British government was under severe domestic pressure, with parliamentary debates stretching through the night. What were the specific criticisms leveled against their war conduct? Were they pointing to particular failures or shortcomings?
Criticism of the government's war conduct was widespread, pointed, and highly specific. Sir John Wardlaw Milne led a non-confidence motion, as reported by the Los Angeles Times, specifically criticizing the general conduct of the war.
A non-confidence motion, that's serious.
Very serious. Among the most pressing concerns raised was a lack of dive bombers, cited by both the Daily Herald and Los Angeles Times.
Dive bombers, right. The Stukas had been effective for the Germans.
Exactly. This wasn't just about a specific aircraft type. It spoke to a critical strategic gap. Dive bombers had proven devastating in providing close air support on the Eastern Front, precisely the kind of tactical air superiority the Soviets desperately needed on a potential second front, and something the British evidently struggled to match.
Okay.
There were also concerns about the inferiority of British tanks compared to German Mark III and IV tanks, as noted by the Daily Herald, which had heavier armor and more powerful guns.
So equipment was a major issue being raised.
Yes. And Lord Beaverbrook, then Minister of Production, however, admitted quite starkly that they had no dive bombers to send, citing wartime production priorities.
He just admitted it. We don't have them.
Pretty much. Which suggested a fundamental, deeply entrenched issue rather than a simple oversight in military procurement. This entire debate highlighted significant perceived deficiencies in British military hardware and strategic planning at a critical juncture of the war.
The frustration clearly ran deep in Parliament. Were there calls for changes at the very top of leadership, perhaps even impacting Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself?
The political pressure was so intense that some members of Parliament, like Clement Davies, even demanded impeachment, as reported by the Daily Herald.
Impeachment?
Wow. Yeah, that term, typically reserved for the gravest offenses, signifies the sheer depth of discontent and the crisis of confidence facing the government. The Los Angeles Times further reported on Sir John Wardlaw Milne's controversial suggestion that the Duke of Gloucester, a member of the royal family, be made Commander-in-Chief of all British armed forces.
A royal commander-in-chief. How did that go down?
Not well. This proposal was met with immediate scorn, with fiery Labourite John McGovern reportedly calling it the product of an infantile mentality.
Ouch.
Exactly. This kind of extraordinary, almost desperate suggestion, coupled with the immediate and strong negative reaction it provoked, underscores the acute political crisis and the fervent desire for more effective war leadership that was clearly being debated in Britain. Such internal turmoil inevitably impacted their ability to provide the kind of comprehensive and decisive support that the Eastern Front desperately demanded.
These internal Allied debates, while not directly about the war in Russia, powerfully reflect the global pressure points and the profound ripple effects of the Eastern Front's struggles on Allied strategic thinking and domestic politics. The desperate need for a second front, the allocation of vital resources, and even the very leadership of the war effort were all under intense scrutiny, driven in no small part by the immense sacrifices and battles being fought by the Red Army. Third, human interest stories from Russia. Amidst the grand strategies and the intense frontline battles, the newspapers on July 2, 1942, also offered poignant glimpses into the profoundly human experience of the war, reflecting both the extraordinary hardships endured and the remarkable resilience of those directly impacted.
The most poignant reports directly related to Russia on July 2, 1942, focused squarely on life under siege in Sevastopol.
Right, back to Sevastopol, but the human side.
Exactly. The Associated Press Journal hinted at the dire civilian conditions, noting how the life of the city was dozed, a bit fragmented, but suggestive, when the panzers were thrown against the city. It also referred to beleaguered people up to the ominous date, May 1942, using fragmented text that mentioned dugout as living spaces.
Living in dugouts, just unimaginable.
It really is. This specific phrasing vividly emphasizes the dire conditions and the brutal civilian experience during prolonged siege warfare, where basic existence was relegated to underground shelters as the city above became a ruined battleground. Imagine living for months in a dugout, constantly under fire, watching your city crumble around you. That was the daily reality for thousands.
So extreme civilian hardship was clearly evident. What about the morale and experience of the Red Army soldiers themselves who were enduring such a relentless assault in Sevastopol? How are they holding up under that kind of pressure?
Well, as we touched on earlier, while facing relentless German assaults, the Daily Worker U.S. reported on the stalwart and properly trained Soviet infantry who held their positions without retreating.
That resilience again.
Exactly. It suggests remarkably high morale and a firm resolve in holding their lines, even when faced with overwhelming odds. The Daily Express also noted that Russians are still returning blow for blow, indicating an active and aggressive defense.
Not just sitting back.
No. And that anecdote we mentioned, the Soviet battery commander under German tank encirclement ordering direct fire at me, that desperate act of self-sacrifice. It speaks volumes about the Red Army's fighting spirit and the dire stakes of the battle, that willingness to fight to the last.
While direct first-person accounts from Russian civilians or soldiers were understandably scarce in the Western press, the broader context of a world at war yielded other compelling human stories that speak to the collective experience of the time, often with an indirect but tangible link to the overarching war effort and its global reach.
Indeed. Other reports, though not strictly originating from Russia, vividly illustrate the pervasive human challenges and incredible resilience across the global conflict, often with direct links to the war effort. For instance, survival at sea was a recurring and harrowing theme.
Yeah, you see those stories quite often from this period.
You do. The Los Angeles Times detailed the ordeal of two U.S. Navy sailors, Anthony Pastula and Gene Aldrich, who drifted for an unimaginable 34 days on a life raft after a Pacific battle.
34 days. How did they survive?
They subsisted on a meager diet described as a terra, a coconut, perhaps a small carrier bombing, and shells from drifting logs. Just scraps, really.
Incredible.
And in a testament to human ingenuity and hope, they even managed to fashion a ring from pearls. Pastula had been given by natives, a small detail that underscores their determination to cling to normalcy amidst extreme hardship.
Wow.
Another similar story, reported by the Canberra Times, involved a party in a trawler off the Australian coast, subsisting on fish and onions for days after their engine failed. These stories collectively highlight the constant and pervasive perils faced by sailors and civilians alike on the high seas during wartime.
Beyond the direct perils of combat or sea, the war also imposed significant domestic challenges on the home fronts of allied nations. What were some of the reported examples of these pressures impacting everyday life and war production?
Well, the Daily Mirror Sydney reported a major disruption on the Australian home front. 470 collieries are on strike today, leading to a substantial loss of 1,600 tons of coal production.
Strikes during wartime, that must have been controversial.
Highly. These industrial disputes, some lasting for 4 days, directly highlighted the immense domestic strains on war production, as labor issues impacted the supply chain for critical wartime resources like coal, which was essential for power and industry.
Right, everything needed coal.
Pretty much. Furthermore, both the Daily Mirror Sydney and the Times detailed new tea rationing rules in Australia, limiting purchases to 1 coupon for 2 ounces and specifying coupon validity until August 10th.
Even tea was rationed.
Oh, yes. And the Times also raised concerns about very few eggs in autumn and winter in Britain due to farmer pricing issues. These reports illustrate in granular detail how the war significantly affected the daily lives, consumption habits, and even the most mundane aspects of existence for civilians far from the front lines.
It's clear that the war's impact extended to every household. What about within the military itself, beyond the direct battlefields? Were there reports on military discipline and morale that shed light on the internal workings of the armed forces?
Yes. The press also covered incidents relating to military discipline, which offered insights into the challenges of maintaining order and morale within a vast, mobilized force. The Daily Express noted a serious case where a lieutenant was found guilty of manslaughter for shooting a Canadian private soldier in a Guildford street,
Manslaughter. Goodness.
being sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. This incident, while not directly combat news, underscored the strict discipline maintained within the armed forces during wartime and the grave consequences for infractions.
Right.
The Canberra Times reported a court-martial where a gunner was charged with being asleep at his post at a coastal battery station, though he was subsequently released for service. These incidents, though seemingly minor in the grand scheme of the war, highlighted the constant vigilance required and the challenges of managing large, diverse populations under military law.
And efforts to boost morale.
Yes. The Herald Mail also reported on a new Army pamphlet titled Comrades in Arms, aimed at emphasizing mutual respect and confidence between officers and men. This suggests a proactive effort to maintain morale and cohesion within the ranks, recognizing the psychological demands of prolonged conflict and the importance of healthy relationships between leaders and their troops.
These glimpses into the lives of individuals, whether facing direct combat, arduous survival challenges, or the mundane hardships of wartime rationing and military discipline, truly remind us of the immense and varied personal impact of this global conflict. It's a powerful counterpoint to the larger strategic narratives and a reminder that behind every headline, there were real lives being shaped and challenged. 4. Reports of atrocities, injustice, or war crimes in or related to Russia. Beyond the battles and the personal stories of resilience, the newspapers on July 7, 1942, also carried disturbing reports of alleged and confirmed acts of injustice and brutality, reflecting the darker, often horrifying side of wartime and human conflict. What were some of the most striking accounts of this nature?
Well, reports from occupied territories brought news of severe repressions, highlighting instances of what could be considered Nazi judicial atrocities in occupied Czechoslovakia. Both the Chicago Tribune and Los Angeles Times reported grimly that courts-martial in Prague and Bruin sentenced 115 persons to death yesterday,
115 people in one day.
in one day. The charges, as specified by the Los Angeles Times, were chillingly broad and indicative of a complete lack of due process. Things like having been in contact with enemy agents, approving the attack on the late Gestapo leader Reinhard Heydrich, failing to report to the police, or even just possession of arms.
Basically anything could get you killed.
It seems that way. This information reveals the brutal and widespread crackdown by Nazi forces in response to any perceived resistance activities, particularly after the assassination of Heydrich. It illustrates the severe and indiscriminate measures taken to suppress any form of opposition in occupied territories, where justice was clearly a tool of terror.
And these issues of control and injustice weren't limited to occupied territories. Disturbingly, they also surfaced within the Axis powers themselves, and perhaps even more surprisingly, among the Allies.
Right. Internal actions within Germany and its sphere of influence were also reported, indicating a degree of internal instability within the Axis, not just external pressure. The Herald Mail carried a message from Ankara, Turkey, stating that 1,000 German soldiers who refused further to participate in the war had been arrested by the Gestapo and imprisoned in the central prison at Sofia, Bulgaria.
1,000 German soldiers arrested for refusing to fight. That's huge.
It's a shocking number. This report suggests a significant level of internal dissent within the German ranks, and it highlights the ruthless measures the Gestapo was taking to suppress any form of mutiny or refusal to comply with orders. This tells us that even within the seemingly monolithic Nazi war machine, there were definitely cracks.
That's a significant detail, indicating that internal resistance wasn't just limited to occupied lands. What about control within German infrastructure itself, especially their vital wartime logistics?
Well, the Los Angeles Times reported on another measure of draconian control. It noted that a Nazi official named Kaufmann, who was the Gauleiter of Hamburg, a Gauleiter being a regional party leader in the Nazi system, wielding immense power, proclaimed a state of emergency for all German ports.
A state of emergency in the ports. Why?
This drastic action was reportedly taken due to unrest among seamen and longshoremen and disruption of shipping by the destruction or damage of port facilities.
So partly bombing, partly internal unrest.
Seems like a combination. This reveals not only the immediate challenges posed by Allied bombing raids, but also internal instability and the imposition of severe, almost martial law-like responses to maintain order and control essential wartime logistics, particularly in vital areas like the port city of Hamburg.
The period also brought to light instances of injustice that, while not direct war crimes on the battlefield, deeply impacted home front morale and reflected broader societal issues amplified by the war. These were acts of injustice that spoke to deeper societal failings.
Absolutely. These reports of injustice extended to concerns about civilian welfare and civil rights, even in Allied countries. For instance, the Liverpool Echo reported sharp criticism of Birkenhead Town Council for allegedly charging key money.
Key money, what's that?
Essentially, a fee, an amount totaling £5 and sixpence, apparently, charged to people returning to homes damaged by enemy action.
Charging bomb victims to get back into their damaged homes? That's appalling.
It is. It was seen as exploitation during a time of extreme crisis, where those already suffering from the war's destructive impact were further burdened financially simply to regain access to their damaged residences. A truly awful example of profiteering from misery.
That's a particularly egregious example of exploitation on the home front. But beyond economic injustice, were there also reports of racial injustice which could profoundly impact national unity during wartime, especially in a country fighting for democracy?
Absolutely. The Daily Worker U.S., a newspaper with a particular focus on civil rights and labor issues, reported on the impending execution of a Negro soldier named Waller. The paper stated unequivocally that Waller's execution would be not only a grave injustice to the Negro people, but would be a blow to the war effort and national unity. It warned that this kind of racial injustice would be meat for the Hitler agents and defeatists, implying it would be cynically exploited by enemy propaganda to undermine domestic resolve and highlight American hypocrisy.
A propaganda gift to the enemy.
Exactly. The same paper also powerfully highlighted widespread discrimination against Negro people in war industries, quoting black electricians asking, "Why are we not allowed to help win the war? Why isn't President Roosevelt's order against discrimination better enforced?"
So even the fight against fascism abroad didn't stop discrimination at home.
Sadly not.
Yeah.
This powerfully points to critical, unaddressed issues of civil rights and the profound impact on national unity on the Allied home front, underscoring that injustice was a pervasive issue, even for those fighting against tyranny abroad.
Finally, what about instances of injustice in the treatment of neutral parties or violations of established maritime laws? Was the war impacting even those ostensibly outside the direct conflict?
Yes, on the matter of neutral shipping violations, both the Daily Worker US and Los Angeles Times reported on Germany's termination of an agreement for safe conduct voyages by the Swedish liner Drottningholm.
So, revoking safe passage.
Yes, indicating a clear disregard for previously agreed-upon protections for neutral vessels carrying civilians. Furthermore, Argentina's influential newspaper La Prensa, as quoted by the Daily Worker US, sharply criticized the greater brutality of the Rio Tercero case. In this incident, an Argentinian ship was sunk by a submarine after questions about its nationality were asked. After, implying a contempt for neutral rights. La Prensa highlighted the particularly disturbing fact that the ship was sunk first and questions were asked afterward, illustrating a deeply troubling pattern of aggression towards neutral shipping that violated established international maritime laws. These reports collectively highlight the varied and widespread acts of injustice and brutality being reported across the globe on that single day, extending the war shadow far beyond the front lines.
Looking at July 2, 1942, through the raw lens of these newspaper reports, we truly gain a unique and deeply layered appreciation for the complex realities of World War II.
Definitely.
From the desperate house-to-house fighting in Sevastopol and the launch of Hitler's summer offensive around Kursk, to the intense political maneuvering in Allied capitals and the profoundly human stories of survival and shocking injustice, it was a single day packed with significant events and profound human experiences.
It truly underscores how quickly the information environment could shift, and how the granular details reported by contemporary sources can provide such a vivid and immediate picture of history unfolding.
Yeah.
This deep dive has allowed us to connect these individual reports into a broader, more nuanced understanding of the immediate pressures, the strategic complexities, and the human conditions of that specific day.
And as you reflect on this incredibly dense snapshot of July 1942, consider this. How might the specific details reported in the daily press, often under immense pressure and with limited conflicting information, influence the long-term historical narratives we construct about major conflicts?
That's a great question.
It's a question about the enduring power of the very first draft of history and its lasting imprint on our collective memory.